It is good to be back with my friends at Common Table. This is the last week of this Common Table. I'll have new friends here, hopefully the next time we meet. And it's almost sad. We can always have our own covert Common Table somewhere. But the way we're doing this, we're going to change our group up for the next series. We're wrapping up our first series ever. Cool. And so we've talked about prayer. I'll check in on homework on that in a minute. We've talked about Bible reading, actually the apostles' teaching, but Bible reading. We've talked about fellowship and community, especially with virus. And today the title is Breaking Bread. And honestly, as I was preparing this, I almost said Breaking Bad like 5 times. You know, I hadn't even seen the show, and so for some reason the phrase was sticking with me that way. I don't know why that is. I kept wanting to say that instead of the other. So let's do this. Our homework from last week was practice sentence or breath prayer. How's that check-in going? How did we do? Today?
Mm-hmm. But I wore it out.
There you go. The only reason I ask is like, did we have homework?
I know. I texted, do we have homework? Why didn't I leave you out of that text? Why didn't I start a new thread?
Should have asked one of them so I couldn't bust you on it.
Well, to be fair, I'm not going to hang her out to dry here because, yeah, and it's funny because looking back over my week, I was like, yeah, I prayed that sentence prayer a lot. But when it came to homework, I forgot about the homework, right? So when Elizabeth sent that text out, I was like, tell me again exactly what? And I was like, oh, yes.
And you prefaced it with, this isn't to the whole group.
I did. I said, this isn't to the whole group.
Okay, we're leaving the teacher out of the rest of the text messages.
Because I was just like, wait a minute, what? But then I was like, oh, yeah, a sentence prayer. I said, oh, yeah, I've been doing that all week. It's been quite a week.
I don't know if this qualifies, but I've been praying my back would stop hurting all day today because I've got a pulled muscle from first day of Matthew carrying him around Sudeth Elementary School, I think is where it happened. So I've been going, please let my back stop hurting. That's been my breath prayer all day today. Please let my back stop hurting, I'm miserable. But other than that, I've failed on the homework assignment this week. Like I don't really, at least with any kind of intentionality. I didn't like pick a day and nail a breath prayer and carry it through the way I told you to. So I'm owning up to not doing the homework, okay? Unless you count, stop hurting. But yeah, so I didn't do it this week, but I do like that one. I just was not intentional with it. I probably did some breath prayers. Sunday, don't let me flood the Apostles' Creed. Oh, well, that didn't work. You know, but I didn't do our specific requests, so there you go. But that's the beauty of us coming together like this is like the spiritual journey of going, how you doing on this? How you doing on this? And then A, when we blow it, you're not done. That's the first thing. But B, we'll never get around to doing it unless we're constantly kind of like gently nudging each other along to do some of this stuff. And that's a picture of that. It's like, the pastor didn't even do the breath prayer this week. So everybody's safe. It's a gracious environment. What about you, Parker? Did you experience it?
I did. Mine was a little more purposeful than it has been in previous weeks. We talked last week, that's one of the few things in my prayer life that I do have. So as I did them semi-naturally when I would normally do them, I would say it and I go, oh yeah, homework. Let me do it again just to make sure it sunk in. So yeah, a little more purposeful, a little more thought behind why I was doing it.
And he's the one you should check with on homework because he has to watch the video.
Right, and he was the one who responded today.
He's the one that's like, oh yeah, I got this. Yeah, I know what's going on with that. Anyway, so as I said, this is our last week. The anchor verse for the whole series has been Acts 2:42. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and prayers. I mentioned that I kept wanting to say breaking bad, but when I say the phrase breaking bread, what comes to mind?
Communion.
Communion. Okay, so everybody's right there with the sacrament thing. Cool. I think in some cases, let's break bread together is usually an invitation to a meal, maybe. But yeah, we definitely associate, he took the bread and he broke it, right? And I think in this context, that's certainly it. So that's really the two aspects we're going to kind of talk through as we look through some scriptures together is this idea of breaking bread as hospitality and as sacrament. And so there's both pieces there, and we'll kind of get into that as we do that. But yeah, breaking bread, let's break bread together. That sounds kind of churchy and weird, but that's what they're talking about when they say it. They broke bread together. There's you a gift. So, so let's look at a Bible passage. This is Luke 14, 12 and 14. Before we do that, why do you think breaking bread was a central practice of the early church? Because this came out of Acts 2:42, right?
I mean, food is one of the few things in the world that we stop to do 2 or 3 times a day. Whatever we're doing, it's lunchtime. Go have a lunch break. So that, especially in olden times, I'm sure, there wasn't as much to do. So
Times of yore.
So that's how you marked your day. I had lunch, I had dinner, maybe ate breakfast.
Yep. Any other thoughts on that one? Why was breaking bread be included with prayer and apostles' teaching and fellowship?
Well, it also well, I know back in that day, that's one way they showed hospitality, but then, Jesus taught about there's a banquet in heaven, and he associated the idea of the breaking bread, and there's going to be a banquet in heaven, and we're all going to be around the table. And you were talking about it Sunday too, hoping that there'd be just unlimited Oreos.
Yes.
Yes.
Without that's my picture of heaven. Oreo buffet with no calories.
Yes, without the caloric.
And plenty of milk.
Yes.
To go with it.
Yes, without all the calories. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's like Chick-fil-A, Oreos, no waistline expansion. Yeah, I can deal with that. You know what I mean? That's not, hey, streets of gold, I can have buffets of Oreo, okay? This is Luke 14, 12 through 14. He said to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they might invite you in return and you would be rewarded or repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Man, if I was going to do a series on weird, off-the-wall things Jesus says, that passage might show up in there. If you're going to throw a banquet, when you throw a banquet, and don't invite your rich friends or the people you already know, invite everybody else. What stands out to you about verse 12, that very first part of that? He said, the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your rich neighbors in case they might invite you in return and you'd be repaid. Anything stand out about that passage, that one verse?
Well, I mean, just don't do things with the expectation of getting it repaid to you is kind of what I hear through the whole thing.
Sure. You invite them, they pay you back. It's kind of like when you give Christmas gifts and you're like, hey, I buy you a $50 gift, you buy me a $50 gift. I could have just bought myself a $50 gift. I mean, the trade-off is the same. Of course, the thought that counts, that's a whole other conversation. But that's kind of what he's saying. If I throw a party for you and you reciprocate, we're even. I've already been rewarded for being generous to you and you're being generous to me. It's kind of the same idea. Anything else?
That's, what I thought about is just generosity and taking care of those that don't have what you have, giving to those that just don't have.
That wouldn't get a party otherwise.
That's right.
Right? What's interesting to me is he doesn't say if you throw a party. He says when you throw a party. Or when you host a dinner, or when. In other words, he almost by default, by the way he asks the question, we're supposed to. There's no, if you ever do this, it's when you do this. Don't associate with the folks you already have connection with and invite those that need it. But this when instead of if thing is pretty interesting. Because the assumption is we will. I'm like, whoa, this goes back to the hospitality thing, which is where we're starting, right? We're supposed to invite people in. We're supposed to be hospitable. We're supposed to be generous or charitable. It's supposed to be what Christians are known for. I asked the question before we read the verse, like, why would they include breaking of bread and fellowship up there with prayer and reading the Bible? Because that's how they share the gospel, is by demonstrating hospitality. That's how who did he say to invite in? And you were right. Jesus talks about it in terms of imagery in his teaching, and we'll get to this in a minute, but even the way he institutes his covenant with his church is over food.
Yeah. I was sitting here thinking about Exam Slam, and this last time we had a survey, and it had out like what are the top things that, you appreciated the most or whatever, and it was food and hospitality neck and neck. I mean, which I thought it was interesting because, of course, we knew that they would like the food. I mean, that was a huge draw and a lot of fun. But it was seriously neck and neck with those two, food and hospitality.
It's one of the standards of college ministry, right? Have food, they will come. I'm pretty sure that's a 10th or 11th, that's an 11th or 12th commandment somewhere. Have food and college kids will come, show up. All right, so I read the verse with breaking bread and fellowship. How is breaking bread and fellowship, what's the difference between those two? Both phrases are in the verse. And we just heard Jesus talk about hospitality, but what's the difference between breaking bread, having a meal together, and fellowship? What's the distinctive?
Well, this is my idea. Fellowship, we can all be standing around and talking and that be fellowship. Fellowship doesn't necessarily have to have food, but when you get down to breaking bread, it's a bit more intimate. You're around a table, you are looking at each other a lot of times, and you are sharing a common meal together, and it's generally a time where you talk about more serious things.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I like the intimacy part of it is a difference in dimension, right? I mean, hanging out to hang out is one thing, but coming together over a meal.
I was thinking about the word intentional. There's like on the surface fellowship, and then there's like, I want to connect with you fellowship. Sure. I think there's so you're more intentional when you're really wanting to sit down with somebody and connect with them.
Nothing to add that one? Well, I mean, when I say breaking bread, all of you said communion. So one of the distinctives is the phrase, at least in this context, breaking bread versus fellowship has a more sacramental or spiritual weight to it than just fellowship, That's a distinctive. So the purpose is different, being more intimate. Maybe it's more of a spiritual or a sacred moment because you're sharing life a little more intentionally together. It's deeper than just surfacey fellowship, but I think it's also in the passage we just read. I think Jesus says, don't throw a banquet just to have fellowship. Throw a banquet to demonstrate breaking bread, hospitality. The difference in the group is important. So he says, hey, anybody can invite all their friends and they're going to invite you. Invite those who would never have a party. So the whole purpose is different. The target audience is different. And the reward is different. He goes, you'll get your reward from your other invite, but you'll get your reward in heaven if you demonstrate hospitality. And so there's an outreach focus to people you don't know yet that's different from fellowshipping with those that we do. We see it at church, right? You ever notice this at a worship, pre-COVID when you could hang out in a sanctuary, but you go right to the people you know, you hang out with people you know, ushers cluster with the other ushers and talk. We naturally fellowship with people we're already connected with. And the visitor shows up and the ushers are over here talking about the football game. Not our ushers, because ours are sanctified. No, but but it happens. In other words, we gravitate to those we fellowship with. Our tendency is more natural in that direction. That's why Jesus has to go, don't just party with those you know. Party to reach out. Break bread to invite in. It's one of the reasons the centerpiece of this and what we've called it is a common table, because the common table has kind of the sacramental language to it too, the more intimate feel. It's not just a small group, it's a table we all have in common. Apostles teaching, breaking bread, fellowship, prayer. In other words, this is what unites Christians. It was the first practices in Acts 2. I might be getting ahead of myself, but I do that sometimes. Okay, which one of those two things, with that distinctive in mind, which one of those are you more comfortable with and why? I mean, I just said we gravitate to one. But which are you more comfortable with inviting others in to do hospitable, or are you more comfortable with hanging with those you know?
Hanging with those I know.
Okay. I mean, I think everybody's answer will probably be hanging with those that you know. The times that I've gone up to other people, I mean, it's funny, it's like this level of like bravery or something that has to happen. I mean, which is silly. You're going to go introduce yourself to somebody new. Like, what is the worst that can happen? But, I kind of feel like I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm supposed to do. Pump myself up and then go over there. And it always ends up fine. It ends up great, or it's awkward. It's either great or it's awkward and then it's over, But I have to be real intentional about it, because otherwise it's just be easy to talk to your own friends. So you have to be really, I keep using the word intentional, but.
Yeah. The first time I talked about this a couple weeks ago, but the first time I got into a small group in a church was when I really felt connected to the church in general. And that's because when I did show up on Sunday, I had a group I could go and talk to. I had somebody I felt a connection to that I could walk straight up to, comfortably speaking. And so I would gravitate to the fellowship because I had never even had that connection in a church in the same way before. But once you have that, it's like you don't want to branch off from your tribe or your clique. It's like, I'm comfortable here, I'm safe here. The introvert in me goes, I got to go talk to people. The alarm bells go off. As a pastor, what if I neglect them and don't talk to them, but I talk to them? That's not intentional. That's like, you can't get out of some conversations and you don't get over there. All the introvert stuff is like, oh, that plays in my head. So, I mean, we gravitate because we know them and there is a comfort level. And yet Jesus goes, don't invite the ones you know, invite the ones you don't know. Now, it's really funny we're talking about hospitality and breaking bread and connecting with people we don't know in the middle of a pandemic. This is going to be, when we talk about how can we do this stuff while COVID. I mean, that's kind of been the heart of the series, right? I will tell you when we get a little later into this is one of the toughest things to go practice tomorrow. Hey, we're going to have a party at my house, come on. Under COVID, wear your mask. What are you going to what are you going to do? It's going to be harder to be intentional in the discipline of hospitality. We're going to have to think creatively about how can I practice that discipline with all these restrictions. But he doesn't say if you throw a party, he says when. Christians are supposed to party. That's the side message to that one. Okay, a theology of hospitality, if you will. This is Matthew 25, 34 to 40. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom, prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me in. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that you saw a stranger who welcomed you, or were you naked and we gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Now that's obviously a story that Jesus is telling about the coming kingdom of the Lord, right? But I think in it is a theology of hospitality. Why is hospitality, based on that passage, why is hospitality a spiritual practice? Why is it a when and not an if?
Because hospitality doesn't have to be throwing a party.
Right.
It can be a simple act.
Yeah, none of that was party language, right? Okay.
Oh, yeah, that.
Ditto. All right.
Well, and tied to hospitality again is generosity.
Yeah. Retweet.
Retweet. I love it.
I like that one. I'm stealing it.
Okay, so hey, I like that. That's good. The reason I call it a theology of hospitality is this. Who are we doing the hospitality for? We just sat here and said, we're uncomfortable going up to strangers. That's not our default. And I even share insecurity, introversion, my own personal at stake by risking, right? So what's holding me back from practicing is my own vulnerabilities, my own insecurity, my own focus on me. Jesus says, when you do this for these people, it's as if you did it for me or to me. Inherent in that is our reason for being hospitable. We're not doing it for us. We're not even doing it for them. We're doing it for God. Think about that. So when you give, when you invite into your home, when you donate to the food bank, when you do whatever it is that's generous, you're not doing it so like, look how spiritual I am, you know, or I really want to help this person. That's a good intention. The motivation is, it's literally an act of spiritual worship towards Christ. To be hospitable is to go, I am worshiping God through this action, which ought to take Mr. Introvert and go, why do you care what they think? You're not doing it to make yourself look better. You're not doing it for them. And so he's talking about kingdom, and he's talking about living on purpose, and he's talking about all those things that's in that parable, but he's also given us, this is why. Because notice who the crowd is. Who's the crowd in that passage? Who's he talking about? When you do to who?
Those that are suffering.
Those that are suffering. Those that don't have food. Those that are sick. Those that are in prison. And in Luke 14, who do you invite to the banquet?
Those who are not your friends.
The same group.
That's right.
It's almost as if he knows what he's talking about. You know what I mean? Invite them to the banquet. Why? Because when you invite them, you're inviting me. Okay. No wonder it's a when and not an if. Right? When you invite Jesus, I'm down. I'm going to invite Jesus to my house tomorrow. You know what I mean? It changes everything. It helps eliminate some of the obstacles. What about, I said it's hard during COVID. How does that change hospitality in a pandemic context? Or does it?
Well, I think the execution of it is going to look different. You know, you're not going to typically, but then again, I mean, I don't know. What I was about to say is, you know, we can't all gather together, but on the other side of that, my next thought was, well, there's churches that on Sunday mornings, they're hosting watch parties that a group of 10 or 12 that you've been around, you get together in a home and you share a meal and you watch the service and you answer questions, and that is your Sunday morning worship since we all can't be together. And I mean, and that's even around us too. You know, this isn't just the huge mega churches where that's happening, you know? So, I mean, some people still doing it and some aren't, but I think as far as hospitality goes, when there is a need and you can meet that need, and I think you've got to have your eyes open for the opportunities that God brings your way, what those call those divine appointments, where you just cross someone's path, you discover a need, and you're like, I can meet this need. And you are opening yourself up to that person, and you're showing generosity and hospitality by meeting whatever that need is right there. even if it is providing food for them. You may not go into their house, you may not be inviting them into your house, but in some ways you are participating in a breaking of bread by providing that for them. But in this COVID environment, I think it's difficult, more so than others, because before the camera started rolling, I mean, we named the few people that are not going to be with us here for a little while because they have relatives that are in, situations where, although those people we're talking about are healthy, they run a huge risk of being exposed and then passing it on to a relative that is at risk, So, I don't know. I'm kind of talking around the...
Yeah, because what happens when you have that opportunity, as you said, and you can meet it, but you've got anxiety over being exposed, for example?
Yeah.
Because sometimes there's opportunities.
Sure.
And y'all know me, I'm like, let's have church. But we got to be smart, you know what I mean?
Right.
We got to be wise. You can't just be like, I'm going to play in the highway, God's going to protect me. We can't be that silly.
Right.
That's not what I'm advocating by any stretch of the imagination. But if the opportunity and the ability is there, then if my hesitation is fear, then I've got to go back to this theology of hospitality that says, I'm not doing it because of me. You know what I mean? And that doesn't mean be reckless. I'm not advocating that by any stretch of the imagination. But if my own self-interest is blocking me, then I've got to at least think that through that filter, Because you can't be unwise. I'm just going to do whatever I feel like, and if I get it, I get it. That's not what I'm saying. But if God goes, here's this person who needs you. You've got the capability of doing it. I've said when, not if. But you're a little nervous about being sick. What do? You know what I mean? You take all the precautions you should take. And if you can still meet the need, you meet the need. But one of the things around the church conversations is we want to do this, and we want to do this, and almost every conversation, as soon as we say, let's do this, we go, oh, but we can't. And that's the reality of what we're living in right now. That's why we're sitting right here doing what we're doing and creating videos and talking to each other in this context and further apart and all that kind of stuff is because this is what you got to do what you got to do. Here's this opportunity and let's run with it. But our instincts are, I don't want to embarrass myself, or I don't want to cost myself something. And generosity involves risk, is what I'm getting at. Generosity does cost you something on some level. Because remember, in Luke, Jesus says, don't throw the party and then get repaid, because you'll get repaid in heaven, right? The risk has a reward. Maybe not the immediate benefit. Maybe you don't even go into their home. Maybe you don't see the benefit of the generosity of what you do for them, but the reward is still present. That was in the passages we've been reading. You did this for me, not them. It's really interesting.
I was sitting here thinking while he was talking that my sentence prayer that I did today, a lot of, was open my eyes to blessings and suffering. And I was thinking with that, one, a lot of times I might see suffering and I don't always see the blessings. And then other times I see the blessings and I don't see the suffering. But then with the word open, I had thought several times today, so not only do I need to see what's going on in somebody else's life or in the world or whatever, but take it to the next step. So as you were talking and as Will was thinking, I was like, well, this is kind of perfect with what my little prayer was all day. That not only do I have to be open to blessings and suffering, but open to solution might not be the right word I'm going for, but opportunity to do something, And the other thing I was thinking of was, this sounds kind of silly or whatever, but my grandfather, so he was real old. I was really young when he was alive. And he lived up on Louisville Street, which is right by Section 8 housing. One of the housing authorities, or Starkville Housing Authority. So, a lot of people that live there are in some kind of a lower income range. And anyway, he had this huge garden, and it was just him and us. And I remember I don't remember it every summer, but I remember one summer in particular, and I'm sure it happened even other summers, but people would come up from the neighborhood just every so often with a bag and say, "Hey, Mr. Mack, I'm here to get my vegetables." And he would just open his garden up, and people would come in and get, vegetables and talk for a moment and then leave. And it was just a creative way to be hospitable to people, and really anybody could have his vegetables. He really didn't care. He wanted to open it up to anybody. But I don't know, as you were talking, I was sitting here, just that memory came into my head, and I was thinking, what a neat way to be hospitable and to give, we were talking about food and talking about all that. It just seemed like an appropriate story to share.
It's a community garden. People have those now. That's literally what they do.
Right.
You just grow the food to give it away to those that don't have food to eat.
Yeah.
He was all over it. He already had it figured out.
That's right.
Had an opportunity, had a way to do it, gave of himself sacrificially to do it.
But it was so great because I just remember people, it was such an ease. There wasn't that awkwardness, probably because all of that had already, people had been welcomed in, but there was just a special spirit with it, and even talking to people who came, to get vegetables. And I knew he was sharing his vegetables with other people too. It wasn't necessarily just for this neighborhood, but he included and made sure that they knew you're welcome at my table or you're welcome at my garden.
Well, you all jumped straight to sacrament when I said, what do you think of when I say breaking bread? Talk to me about your experience with the sacraments in church. And you know what I mean when I say that, right? Baptism and or communion. In this context, really a communion, because we're talking about breaking bread, but they're both sacraments. Tell me about your experience with sacraments. How have they shaped your spiritual walk? I can't wait to hear these stories. Because she's already grinning over like, I got a story for you.
I'm laughing because I grew up in a church that, we passed the little shot glasses, and there was, I don't know what else to call them.
The Jesus shot glasses.
I don't know what else to call them, they're shot glasses. But the whole outer realm was dark grape juice, and the middle was wine, And I can remember at one age, just one Sunday, me being like, I'm going to grab this wine really quickly and drink it. My parents can't do anything about it. So that's what made me laugh when you said...
I'm going to defy my parents in church.
And they didn't even say a thing about it, because I think they knew I was probably doing it for attention, But when you said that and you said, how did it shape you? I was thinking, I can remember just every Sunday looking at that and being like, and then trying it at one point. But my favorite, I'll say this, so to get off of that silly story, I love when we welcome everybody to the table. And it's like made, very much said like, this is not a Methodist table. I mean, and I grew up Presbyterian, and it was the same way. It was not a Presbyterian table. It was a table for all. And that was always, that's like my favorite part of the whole part.
Imagine that.
I guess like more people than I realized, but like journeyman through my spiritual life growing up. I joke, whatever God is, I'm safe. I was sprinkled as a baby Catholic, baptized first as Baptist, then non-denominational. For a while there, I went with my grandparents and they were Episcopal. Now I'm here working in a Methodist church, so I think I've got most of it covered at this point. But growing up with my grandparents, it was communion wafers. They were like cardboard. You put them on your tongue and it like dissolved. And I just remember, kind of go back to yours, I remember the first time like I was gonna take communion and I was excited. My Nana brought over like a couple just so I could get used to it so I wouldn't freak out as like a 6-year-old, like, oh my God, what is this? This isn't bread. And then just that being a big part of it, of church, was going through the sacraments. That's what it revolved around. Is every Sunday was communion at some point. Never drank the wine, didn't like it for whatever reason. Just I always, just crossed my arms and got the bread, got the blessing, went on. But it's interesting kind of going through my life because in that instance, it revolved around the sacraments in that church. In other churches, it revolves around the speaking and the preaching. And they both nurture my soul in different ways and in different seasons. In some seasons, it taught me, to be thankful, right? Look back on it and go, this is the consistency. Even if my life isn't consistent, this is consistent. So.
It's been I was laughing about your story and thinking about, because I grew up, in Baptist church. Now, the Baptist church I grew up in was interesting because even in the 80s, we had a band, and they led us on Sunday nights. So, it was looking back, I'm like, that was kind of progressive, back in that time,
We were ahead of the curve.
That's right. But, we had the old juice tray, if you will, and the little Jesus
sounds
shot
better.
glasses. Yeah.
The shot glasses, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And the
No, I love it.
The little platter with the bread, and you pass it down, and of course I've got a couple of memories of where people, would eat the wafer, and you hear people go like, because it'd be like so dry, and it's like, I need something else to drink, and I can remember helping, being asked to help at some point, and I was so nervous to drop. I'd drop it, and I just remember my hand shaking, and I was like in high school. I'm like, oh God, I'm gonna drop the juice. Don't let me drop the juice, right there, nervous, and then
It was so heavy and cumbersome.
Yes. And I remember and then when it'd be passed to me, I would just put this ninja grip on it. I'm like, not today, Satan, pass it on down. But then how that changed. Like in college, and I'd go lead retreats or go on retreats, and they'd have communion there. And then being on staff for churches, being the worship pastor, and I've been a part of churches where we would intentionally change communion up and do it different, and the way it looks, and all this kind of stuff, and just how it's different. It's different for everybody, but it's a holy moment. Which, and that's what really sticks out to me, whether it is the juice and the little tray being passed, whether it's different stations set up or different ways to do it, or even in a Catholic service where it is don't mess with the cup. Priest got the cup, that's that. But it doesn't matter what your experience is or how you take it. It's a holy moment for everybody.
Yeah, I have one of those childhood stories too, where it was like Presbyterian church, you couldn't take communion until you'd been through communicants class, they called it. Professed faith. It's an open table, but it's an open table to Christians, was kind of the Presbyterian background. And so at 12, they pushed like we do confirmation, they pushed all the 12-year-olds through this different Sunday school class to answer all the questions, and you graduate by becoming a Christian. That's literally, you understood the faith, and you could profess it to the elders, and that's how you became a Christian. Then you could have the juice and the snack in church. And I remember thinking, that's why I wanted to go through. I want the snack, because you get to 12 and the preacher's still talking, and you're hungry. I'm like, they're serving crackers and juice to everybody else, but me, I'm going through the class. So by the time I'm 10, 11, 12, the first time I actually took communion is because I wanted the Sunday snack that everybody else was getting, and I wasn't. It had no spiritual weight yet. It had no significance. Just like, why? I felt excluded. Talking about the table being open. I'm like, why can't I do it? It's like right here. And you're talking about
Our Presbyterian church must have broken the rules or something.
Well, you're talking about,
I was doing it
sneaking the wine
before
sneaking the
confirmation.
Wine. I remember this just occurred to me after 40 something years, but I remember they put them back in the little holders in the. I can't believe I'm admitting this on video. And then they pray. I'm like, I wanted that juice so bad. I'm like, I'm taking whatever was left in the bottom of that cup from my parents' cup.
You got your tongue down in it, you're licking it. Like, that's good.
That was how much I wanted to be a part of it.
Yeah.
But I did not understand the spiritual significance of it at the time. Sure. I had no idea this was a holy moment. I had no idea. Maybe there was something by default in me that says you want to be a part of this, but I certainly didn't cognitively know what it was. So bad I'm drinking the leftovers.
Now, let me preface, it wasn't until I was older
Yeah.
to really realize, and it doesn't matter who it is, it's a holy moment to everybody. I
Right.
mean, I remember, being a kid going, I can't have two. I want two.
It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, well, pass it back around.
That's right. That's all you're going to give me? That little thing?
I remember talking to my dad when I was younger, and I asked him, like, what do you think about during communion? Because it was long, it takes a long time to pass all of that and all this stuff. And so I remember asking him, because I was very much in that I'm taking what you're handing me, I'm taking. But he was like, I remember he told me, he said, Elizabeth, it's not just about taking, it's about giving. And he said, you're supposed to be giving of yourself, and you're supposed to be giving God your sins and giving him, the room to forgive you. And I mean, and I think about that. I can't believe I didn't say that before I talked about the wine, but I think about that every communion, is Dad saying it's about giving. And that was so weird to me, because I was thinking, well, yeah, they're giving me, but realizing it was me that needed to be giving.
To take it with the right heart is to come to the table confessing and acknowledging that you need a Savior. I mean, that we need Jesus every day. It's not just a snack at the end of the church or whatever, but it's literally, for lack of a better word, and we don't use this word this way anymore, but it's a ritual. Yeah. I mean, that's what really sacrament's all about, is it's this repetitive spiritual discipline that we do that shapes who we are. We've been talking this whole series about spiritual disciplines, right? Whether it was practicing Lectio as a different way to read the Bible or sentence prayers, the whole point is that formation that comes out of habit. I mean, we're all recalling stories from 30 years, 15 years ago, like a long time ago. Why? Because they're ingrained in us. You know what I mean? And we do this every Sunday. I remember I saw my dad every Sunday. I mean, like, that's exactly the language of habit that I'm talking about. And there's a phrase, there's a sentence in a book that I had to read not too long ago that said something along the lines of this. I'll have to paraphrase it if I don't get it exactly right. But we don't think our way into a new way of acting. We act our way into a new way of thinking. And when you apply that to the spiritual world, that's why daily reading, daily prayer, weekly worship, sacraments more frequently than once a year. Like, that's why those things shape who we are, is because we act our way into a new way of seeing things. And so sometimes we will do spiritual practices long before we really get them on a deep level. And eventually it's like, we know what it is. I mean, it's part of who we are. And that's why it's like, if you do it different, people are like, no, you can't do it different, because it's a habit.
It's a big deal, too.
It's a big deal. No, you can't change the carpet color. Like whatever it is, like we are by default creatures of habit, because the habits actually shape the way we think before more than thinking shapes the way we do stuff. Because, honestly, and I love this comparison, we all know how to eat to be healthy. Like if I quizzed people, they'd be like, yes, low carb, whatever, like here's how you eat to not gain weight. Do we do it? Not all the time, for sure, right? The whole point is, like, if I want to lose weight, all I have to do is what I know how to do. These things. Exercise, eat this type of food, I'll lose weight. I know it. I don't do it. But if you ever experience it in reverse, once you start working out or once you start dieting, it has this, I don't want to quit now momentum to it. In other words, and then if you ever, like, for Lent, drop soft drinks and then take a Coke on Easter, and it feels like it's 150% sugar, right? It doesn't feel like it's part of you anymore. It feels weird. It's hard. Because you've reset everything by your action, not by, but you don't drop them. We can't really just go by willpower, okay, I'm gonna be like Jesus. I mean, we have to start living like him, and then it changes who we are. And so when we talk about hospitality, we talk about breaking bread and this idea of being open to the people around us That's a spiritual discipline. But so are the sacraments. Wesley used to say, anytime you come together, every time you come together, take communion. Every time. Like, you have church, you have communion, and we go, we'll do once a month. You know, some churches we'll do once a quarter. You know, some churches do, like, I don't know, Easter, you know, like maybe Easter and Christmas. You know, every church is different about it. But it's this ritual of I'm giving and receiving from God that should be part of our spiritual practice as often as possible. In a non-COVID world, we'd take communion right now because we've been talking about it. It'd be perfectly appropriate. In fact, we probably had a meal all 4 weeks while we were talking, you know what I mean? That would have been a little more natural what we're talking about when you talk about common table. And this is one of those, well, we can't do that because, you know, it's a virus. And communion hasn't happened in church because of the virus. And so you go, oh my gosh, how do I practice that sacrament in this environment? I wish I had a nice, easy answer, you know what I mean? Because I told you, this is harder to be creative about. Hey, I'm gonna have a party, can't do that. Hey, I'm gonna have communion, can't do that. What can you do to be generous and sacramental in the middle of COVID? You know, it's a challenge. But the generosity idea, the sacrificial idea, you can find a way to do it, but you are gonna have to be more intentional. It's a good word, intentional. It's the right thing to do. There is something spiritual about, or even theological about eating. We kind of launched into the whole thing about that. One last passage. This is Matthew 26, verses 26 to 30. And we've already talked about it, but I just want to read the passage to illustrate the point. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never drink again of this fruit of the vine until the day I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So obviously this is Jesus at the original communion on the night he was betrayed and crucified the next day or that weekend anyway. It's communion. I should know that stuff. Anyway, he institutes the new covenant through the breaking of bread and the taking of the cup. Why do you think he would choose to implement the covenant that way? Why that way? I mean, there's no wrong answer here. This is just speculation. But why that way?
Again, for me, it goes back to intimacy. I mean, he was with those he loved, those he poured himself into, and they were about to light the world on fire. And they were fixing to they're going to be scared for a minute. There was going to be terror, clearly. But it was that togetherness, that intimate moment where he gathered them all around a small place, and he could look them all in the eye and could talk to them and share it over a meal.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine being there and being like, what? Like, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
this is your body?
This is your body and your blood. Like,
your blood?
We're all having fun. Like, it's good times right now. Like, it would be, you know what I mean? To like, I can imagine that being at the time. This is not the question you really asked, but
right.
As you were reading it again, I mean, I hear it all the time when we're in church and doing communion, but trying to think about what it would have been like at that table would have probably been confusion, or maybe it would have been one of those things of like, Jesus just saying his things. Like,
there he goes again.
There he goes again, saying his Jesus things.
There goes Jesus.
But then I'm curious about like that after, like at what point, you know what I mean? At what point were they like, this is my body broken for you. Mm-hmm. This is my blood shed for you. Like, oh, man. Like, he wasn't just being, weird. He was really giving me a message.
I'm really instituting something here. Mm-hmm. And don't forget, Judas is at the table.
Right.
So even as you were talking about, they're about to set the world on fire, but Judas is sitting there too, who's about to betray him. And you're talking about the open table. Anybody can have communion with Jesus, even the guy who's about to throw him over to the Romans.
Yep. And Jesus knew.
And Jesus knew that. In fact, he goes, go do what you're going to do in a little while after that. So you've got this open table, intimate moment. He's breaking bread, and then his words are really interesting. In fact, I thought about it again as I was reading it, because I didn't even think to put this in here, but he says, take and eat, that phrase. And we hear that phrase around church all the time, but it even ties back to the Garden of Eden. Because God tells Adam and Eve, you can take from any tree that you want and eat it. So there is something monumental, fundamental, intimate, communal, spiritual about take and eat. This idea that we're taking from God and being supported, give us, Lord, give us our daily bread. You know what I mean? There is something in the hardwiring of human beings where the eating is theological or a sacramental act. It's a spiritual act. We're reliant on it. We can't go without it. Lord knows some of us need to go without it more often than not, but we can't go without it, right? It's a state. God has set it up so that we are always taking and eating and being sustained by him. And so he goes into this new covenant, building his new church. It's about to set the world on fire, and he says, take from me and eat. And he says the really weird thing, this is my blood in the new covenant,
Right, yeah.
And I mean, but anytime.
That's where everybody's like,
Wait a minute.
What's in the cup? And he goes, and
What's in here?
if you go look through covenants in Scripture, though, they all involve bloodshed. The Passover was the lamb's blood spread across the top of the door. Abraham's covenant between God and Abraham, he said they rip the animal in half, and the Spirit of God walks through it. So you've got bloodshed. It was always part of this whole covenant sacramental thing with God is spilled blood. And so Jesus is going, he's being prophetic. He's like, I'm about to spill my blood so that we can be together. And one of my favorite parts about what he says is, we're not doing it again until we do it again in my Father's kingdom. I love that promise in communion. He goes, one day we will have an Oreo party. One day we will have a party together in the kingdom of God like no other. And I'm not taking part of this again until we do that together. That's a really cool promise. It's not just a covenant. It is a covenant. That's what a promise is. He's promising that we will eat together with him again. Be in the intimate circle at the common table with Jesus again. That's a big deal. That's not the snack at the end of church. It is a big deal. It is open to everybody, but it's a significant, holy moment, spiritual moment where it shapes who we are. And we're missing it in the midst of this season. We're going to figure out a way to participate in communion. Probably in smaller gatherings before larger kind of deal, but we're going to have to figure out something because it is fundamental. And this idea of all of our spiritual habits, Bible reading, prayer, sacraments, even fellowship. I can't remember if I made this comment in the study or before, but I consider sleep a spiritual discipline. You know what I mean? And I'll make that case at another time, but this idea that rest and Sabbath is a spiritual practice, then you could argue that getting enough sleep is a spiritual discipline. I practice that one 6 or 7, 8 hours a day. That's one spiritual practice I can nail. But it is. And so the rhythm of our life, sleep, awake, eat, fellowship, work, whole other sermon, they're spiritual. They're all ritual. Everything is spiritual. They're all ritual designed for us to be who God's called us to be. They can all be worship in that sense, which is really cool when you think about it. So there is homework, even though we're done with our 4-week series. So there won't be any accountability on this question, so I'm just going to throw it out there anyway. Maybe you can text me and I'll be like, did you do it? You know what I mean?
after I text Parker
After you
and say,
text
what
Parker
was
and ask
it?
what the homework was, then I'm going to get all these text messages. Look at me doing my homework 5 minutes after I got the message from Parker. That's great. Parker's the go-to because he watches the video and knows what happened. The homework is really simple. We talked about this earlier. Find a creative way to be hospitable this week. Maybe intentionally so. Come over and have my jambalaya. I've already done my homework.
So spicy.
I literally
teaspoon,
had Parker
not
over my house
tablespoons.
last night for jambalaya, and yeah, he's still scorched.
Yeah, just put a tablespoon, not a teaspoon.
Recipe called for half a teaspoon of cayenne pepper, and I put half a tablespoon in the recipe.
That's a big difference.
Yes, that makes a big difference.
It was great.
I think that's
Don't get me
why-
wrong, it was great.
I think that's why my recipe is so spicy. My wife can't eat it, is I've been putting half a tablespoon this whole time. And I haven't read the recipe right.
And it's probably not half either. It's probably like 3/4 to a full.
No, it is half, because everything else that I put in there spice-wise was half a table. That's how
Okay.
it gets messed up. Again, power of habit. Half a table, half a table, half a table. Cayenne pepper must be half a tablespoon. Who cares if it's supposed to be half a teaspoon? Yeah, it's good. I would have brought it for our fellowship meal tonight if that was an option. But yeah, the homework is to find a way to challenge yourself to be creatively hospitable this week and going forward. Thank you guys for doing this. I get to change out my compatriots for the next series. You'll be like, no, I want community, I'm staying. Okay. We're going to find a new group of people.
I'm going to miss this. I really am. I've really enjoyed it.
You know, I alluded to the power of ritual and habit, and we talked about that. And one of the things that has been obvious to me, especially in a church context, is our spiritual practices, our worship practices, the way we do church is so ingrained in us that even since March, we're headed into the fall, and all we want is for church to be the way it was in March. Why? Because that is the way we are habituated into doing worship. It's not church unless, and I've told you several times, I can't wait to cut loose at Connection and sing, and yes, let's do that, But there is something in us already that is it's like a force of gravity trying to pull us back to March. And it's obvious, and people are like, when can we do what we used to do? When we've got this opportunity to do things like we've never done it before at the same time. To really drive into small groups and to create different ways to do it and be witnesses, people who are losing jobs because of COVID and all this stuff that's going on, these opportunities presented to us, and we've got the ability to respond. And all we're worried about is, can it be like it was? And that is the power of habit. But when we're in this context, this conversation, the habits have already moved the other way, where it's like, you're shaking my hand, hey. We've already formed new reactions to the way things are now. It's like, it used to be keys and cell phone. Now it's like keys, cell phone, mask. Otherwise I can't walk out the door. We've already habituated ourselves to where we are. And those are gonna have power to where when you say, when it goes back to normal, you're like, this is weird. I can sing in here without a mask on.
Gosh, you just...
That's going to feel foreign. On one level, we're going to celebrate. On the other hand, we're going to like, this feels weird. Because habit has already taken over and shaped who we are. And it says, this is what that says, though. You've got to be incredibly careful about what your habits are. It's a whole other series, right? But the cell phone alone is a habit maker. You know what I mean? The screens that we're in front of, that could soapbox on this one another hour, I won't do that. But everything, we're always either forming new habits when we break old ones. We're always creatures of cycle and habit and rhythm. And that's why when Jesus, I tied it back to creation before. God worked for 6 days, seventh day he rested. He set up a rhythm for us at the outset that says 6 days you work, 1 day you have Sabbath, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. In other words, he made us creatures of rhythm. And what COVID has done is rob us of rhythms that are heavily ingrained. But it's also creating new ones. And so we have to be vigilant about the new rhythms that we set, especially in this context. But you're always either forming one or another. That's the reality of it. Because we're made to do that. Let's pray. God, we come together as a small group for a few weeks to talk about spiritual practice and discipline and a common table and a place that we can call home and community and fellowship while we worship you and learn how to worship you with our life. God, I lift up this time. I lift up this group gathered around this table. I lift up those who are watching later. And I pray that you would help us form a spiritual rule or rhythm of life that makes our whole life worship for you. Give us grace when we fail or resist that habit. Empower us with your Holy Spirit to follow through and become more and more like you. In Christ's name, amen.